Ethan followed a stranger into a dark alley, and what he found behind the grocery store shocked him. 1 year earlier, Ethan Walker was the kind of kid who tossed away a perfectly good sandwich because it wasn't what he wanted. But everything changed the day he watched a poor black boy named Malik give half of his only meal to a homeless stranger. Curious, Ethan followed him home and uncovered a heartbreaking truth hidden behind kindness, hunger, and sacrifice. What started with a single sandwich would expose a buried corporate scandal, restore a forgotten father's legacy, save a struggling family, and completely transform the heart of a billionaire's son. But the biggest surprise wasn't who got rescued. It was who changed the most. The lunch crowd filled the restaurant, with the soft clatter of silverware and quiet conversations. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago, reflecting off polished glass and expensive decor. It was the kind of place where business deals were signed over lunch, and where nobody ever worried about the cost of a meal. 12-year-old Ethan Walker sat in a leather booth near the center of the room, staring at the plate that had just been placed in front of him. His expression darkened immediately.
I am not eating this sandwich.
"What is this?" The waitress blinked.
Enjoy your lunch.
"Your sandwich, sweetheart."
I told you.
"That's not what I ordered.
Mayonnaise on this.
It's the turkey club.
Cold.
Just like
I
wanted the grilled chicken one." The woman hesitated.
What is this?
Oh dear, I apologize.
"I'm
Will you
sorry.
immediately?
I can have the kitchen."
Stay back.
But Ethan never let her finish. With a sharp movement, he shoved the plate away. The sandwich slid across the table. The plate crashed onto the floor. Glass shattered. The sound cut through the restaurant like a gunshot. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Pieces of bread, lettuce, turkey, and fries scattered across the polished tiles. For a moment, nobody moved. Then an older employee hurried over. Her name tag read, Mrs. Carter. She was a black woman in her late 60s with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a work cap. Her knees clearly hurt as she lowered herself to the floor. Without saying a word, she began picking up the mess. One piece at a time. Ethan crossed his arms. "I didn't order that."
Clean this up and bring me a new one.
Mrs. Carter looked up briefly. There was no anger in her eyes, only sadness. A sadness Ethan didn't notice. "Of course, honey,"
Don't you worry about it.
she said
Get this
softly.
cleaned up.
"We'll get you something else." A few tables away, people exchanged uncomfortable glances.
Don't you worry.
The restaurant manager rushed over and apologized repeatedly. Within minutes, another meal was being prepared. The entire incident seemed to disappear, at least for everyone except Mrs. Carter. As she carried the broken plate away, she paused for just a second. Her gaze lingered on the untouched sandwich lying in the trash bin. Then she quietly returned to work. Ethan had already forgotten about it. 2 hours later, he sat in the back seat of a black SUV weaving through Chicago traffic. His father, Richard Walker, sat beside him, focused on emails flashing across his phone. Richard Walker was one of the wealthiest men in Illinois. His technology company employed thousands. His face appeared in magazines. His schedule was planned months in advance. Yet despite all that success, he often struggled to understand his son. "Dad." Richard didn't look up. "Can I get the new X-Drone? The one that costs $800? It's actually $900. Richard smiled faintly. "Even better. Everyone at school is getting one." "Everyone?" "Basically." Richard finally lowered his phone. "You have 3 drones already. They're old. They're 6 months old. They're still old." Richard laughed softly. "You sound exactly like me when I was 12. Did your dad buy you everything?" "No." The answer surprised Ethan. "No." "Nope." Richard returned to his emails. And maybe that was a good thing. Ethan sighed dramatically and stared out the window. The city rolled by. Brick buildings, street vendors, Coffee shops, people rushing through their afternoons. The SUV stopped at a red light. Ethan barely paid attention until he noticed someone standing beneath a flickering neon sign at an old bus stop. A boy, about his age, maybe younger. His hoodie looked worn. His sneakers were held together by faded tape. A black backpack hung from one shoulder. The boy sat alone on the bench. In his hands was a sandwich wrapped in paper. For a moment, Ethan assumed he was about to eat. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly homeless man approached the bus stop. His coat was thin despite the cold wind. His beard was gray. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The man looked hungry, very hungry. The boy looked down at his sandwich, then at the man. Without hesitation, he unwrapped it, tore it exactly in half, and handed over the larger piece. The homeless man stared. "You sure?" The boy nodded. "Yeah. But what about you?" "I'm okay." The old man accepted it slowly. His eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you." The boy simply smiled, then sat back down, holding only the smaller half. Ethan felt something strange tighten inside his chest. He couldn't explain it. The image didn't make sense. The boy looked hungry. His clothes looked old. His backpack looked nearly empty. Yet he had just given away half of his food. Not because someone told him to. Not because anyone was watching. Simply because he wanted to. "Dad." Richard glanced up. "What is it?" "That kid." "What kid?" "The one at the bus stop." Richard followed his gaze. He saw the homeless man, the sandwich, the boy, and he immediately understood what Ethan was seeing. "That's nice," Richard said quietly. "But why would he do that?" Richard studied the scene for a moment, then answered, "Maybe because he knows what it feels like to be hungry." The words landed heavily. Ethan looked back toward the window. The boy had started eating his smaller piece. Slowly, carefully, like every bite mattered. Nothing about that looked familiar to Ethan, not one thing. The light turned green. The SUV began moving. Ethan twisted around in his seat to keep watching. The boy stood, adjusted his backpack, then walked away from the bus stop. For some reason, Ethan couldn't stop staring. The image of the shared sandwich replayed again and again in his mind. Mrs. Carter picking food off the floor, the untouched sandwich in the trash, the homeless man, the boy, the half sandwich. Something about it hurt, and he didn't understand why. "Dad." "Yes? Can we go back?" Richard looked surprised. "Go back where?" "To the bus stop." "Why?" Ethan kept watching the shrinking figure through the rear window. "I want to know who he is." The boy disappeared around a corner. Richard raised an eyebrow. "That's unusual." "What is?" "You being interested in somebody else." Ethan didn't answer. Because for the first time in a very long time, his father was right. The SUV continued down the street, but Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the corner where the boy had vanished. Something told him the story didn't end at that bus stop. Something told him that boy was carrying far more than an old backpack. And before the day was over, Ethan Walker would follow him. What he discovered would change everything he thought he knew about hunger, kindness, and the value of a single sandwich. The black SUV rolled through downtown Chicago, but Ethan's attention never left the sidewalk behind them. The image stayed in his mind. The boy, the sandwich, the homeless man, the larger half given away without hesitation. It made no sense. Ethan had grown up in a world where people protected what belonged to them. His classmates compared sneakers, phones, watches, and gaming systems. Everyone wanted more. That boy had almost nothing, yet he had shared. The contradiction bothered him. Dad. Richard Walker looked up from his phone. What now? I want to go back. Richard smiled faintly. Still thinking about him? Yeah. Why? Ethan struggled to answer. Because he didn't know. All he knew was that something felt unfinished. I just want to know where he went. Richard studied his son carefully. For a moment, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Curiosity. Not curiosity about a new gadget. Not curiosity about a toy. Curiosity about another human being. It caught him off guard. Finally, he nodded toward the driver. Take us back. The driver immediately changed direction. 15 minutes later, they returned to the old bus stop. The homeless man was gone. The bench was empty. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. Ethan felt disappointment settle in his chest. Then he spotted him. Half a block away. The same worn hoodie, the same black backpack, the same slow walk. That's him. The driver slowed. Richard glanced outside. Okay. The SUV remained far enough back not to attract attention. The boy never looked behind him. He seemed completely focused on getting somewhere. The afternoon sky had begun turning gray. A cold wind swept through the streets. Chicago winters arrived early. People hurried past carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. The boy carried only his backpack. After several blocks, he reached another bus stop. Unlike the first one, this stop was tucked between an old laundromat and a boarded-up convenience store. The neon lights buzzed overhead. Paint peeled from the shelter walls. A few people waited silently. The boy sat on the bench. Ethan watched from inside the SUV parked across the street. Minutes passed. Then something happened. A man stumbled near the curb. He looked homeless. His coat was dirty. His face was red from the cold. The man lost his balance and fell hard against the side of the bus shelter. Several people noticed. Nobody moved. Some looked away. Others pretended not to see. The boy immediately stood, without hesitation, without fear. He hurried over. Sir? The man groaned. The boy knelt beside him. You okay? No response. The man looked dazed. The boy reached into his backpack. He pulled out a small bottle of water. The same water he probably needed for himself. He twisted off the cap. Here. The man took a sip, then another. Slowly, his breathing steadied. You should sit down. The boy helped him onto the bench. The entire time, nobody else moved. Not one person. Ethan couldn't stop staring. The boy didn't know this man. He didn't owe him anything. Yet he helped anyway. When the man finally recovered enough to speak, he smiled weakly. Thank you, kid. The boy shrugged. No problem. Then he sat back down, as if helping strangers was the most normal thing in the world. Richard had been watching too. His expression softened. Interesting. What? Most adults wouldn't have done that. Ethan looked back at the bus stop. Why did he? Richard didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said quietly, maybe because kindness isn't something you buy. The words lingered. The wind picked up. Rain began falling. Light at first, then heavier. People opened umbrellas. Cars splashed through puddles. The boy simply pulled up his hood and waited. 10 minutes later, a bus arrived. The crowd boarded, but the boy didn't. He remained where he was, watching the bus leave. Ethan frowned. Why didn't he get on? The answer came a minute later. An elderly woman approached carrying 2 grocery bags. She was struggling. One bag tore. Cans rolled onto the wet sidewalk. Several people stepped around them. Nobody stopped. The boy immediately ran over. "Ma'am, let me help." Together they picked up the groceries. The woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you, sweetheart." He carried her bags all the way across the street. When he returned, the next bus had already come and gone. Ethan blinked. He missed his bus. Richard nodded. "Looks like it. But why?" Again, the answer seemed obvious. Because he had been helping someone else. The realization sat heavily inside Ethan. By now, he was beginning to understand something. This wasn't a coincidence. The sandwich wasn't random. The water wasn't random. The groceries weren't random. This boy was simply like this. Kind. Even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. The rain intensified. Dark clouds rolled over the city. Streetlights flickered on. Finally, the boy stood, adjusted the straps on his worn backpack, and started walking. Not toward downtown, not toward the nicer neighborhoods, toward the south side, toward streets that gradually looked older, poorer, more forgotten. The SUV followed from a distance. Richard checked his watch. 10 more minutes. Why? Because after 10 minutes, this becomes stalking. Ethan almost smiled, but he couldn't stop watching. The boy crossed another intersection, past a church, past a community center, past a closed pharmacy. Then something strange happened. Instead of heading home, he turned into a narrow alley behind a large grocery store. Ethan sat upright. Where's he going? The alley looked dark. Delivery trucks were parked nearby. Large dumpsters lined the wall. A security light flickered overhead. The boy disappeared behind the building. Ethan felt a sudden knot in his stomach. For the first time all afternoon, worry replaced curiosity. Why would someone go behind a grocery store in the rain? What was he looking for? And why did it feel like the answer might hurt? Without realizing it, Ethan reached for the door handle. His eyes never left the alley, because something told him the real story was only beginning. And whatever waited behind that grocery store was far worse than anything he had imagined from the comfort of the back seat of a billionaire's SUV. Rain drummed softly against the windows. Ethan stared into the narrow alley behind the grocery store. The place looked forgotten. A flickering security light buzzed overhead. Rows of metal dumpsters stood against the brick wall like silent giants. Water pooled in cracks along the pavement. The alley smelled faintly of wet cardboard and spoiled vegetables. The boy disappeared behind one of the dumpsters. Ethan's stomach tightened. "Dad." Richard followed his gaze. "Stay in the car." "But, Ethan." His father's voice carried the kind of authority that usually ended every discussion. Normally, Ethan would have rolled his eyes and slumped back into his seat. Tonight was different. For some reason, he couldn't stop thinking about that half sandwich, about the water bottle, about the groceries, about the way the boy kept helping people despite having so little himself. The driver remained silent. Rain tapped against the roof. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. Finally, Ethan saw movement. The boy reappeared, and what he was doing made Ethan's chest hurt. The boy wasn't stealing, he wasn't hiding, he wasn't causing trouble. He was digging through the grocery store's trash, slowly, carefully, as if searching for treasure. Richard sat forward. His expression changed immediately. Ethan had never seen that look before. Shock. The boy opened a garbage bag. He examined something, shook his head, set it aside, then opened another. Eventually, he found a sealed container. His face brightened. Not because it was something valuable, because it was food. The container disappeared into his backpack. Then another. Then another. Ethan swallowed hard. No way. Richard remained silent. The boy moved from dumpster to dumpster, checking expiration dates, inspecting packages, only taking things that still looked safe. His movements were practiced, experienced, like someone who had done this many times before. The realization landed heavily. This wasn't an emergency. This was routine. This was survival. Ethan looked down at his own hands. Just hours earlier, he had thrown away a perfectly good sandwich because it wasn't exactly what he wanted. Now he was watching another kid search through trash for food. The contrast made him feel sick. The rain intensified. The boy's hoodie darkened with water. Still, he kept searching. A sudden shout echoed through the alley. "Hey!" The boy froze. A security guard emerged from a side door. Tall, middle-aged, heavy-set. His flashlight cut through the darkness. "What do you think you're doing?" The boy immediately stepped back. His shoulders dropped. Not angry, not defensive. Resigned. Like he'd heard this before. "Aren't you listening?" The guard marched closer. "I wasn't stealing anything." The boy's voice was calm, respectful. The guard laughed harshly. "That's what they all say. I only took things that were thrown away." "Get out of here." The flashlight beam swept across the backpack. "What do you have in there?" The boy hesitated. For just a second. Then slowly opened the bag. Ethan leaned closer. Inside were several containers of food. Nothing expensive. Nothing special. Just leftovers. The kind most people never thought twice about throwing away. The guard looked unimpressed. "You can't be here." "I'm sorry." The apology stunned Ethan. The boy wasn't angry, wasn't arguing, wasn't demanding anything. He was apologizing for being hungry, for trying to find food, for existing in the wrong place. Something about that felt deeply unfair. The guard pointed toward the street. "Move along." The boy nodded. "Yes, sir." Then he zipped up the backpack. Before leaving, he stopped. Near another dumpster sat a soaked cardboard box. Inside was a tiny orange kitten shivering in the rain. The boy immediately knelt. The guard groaned. "What now?" The kitten meowed weakly. Without hesitation, the boy removed his own hoodie. Despite the cold, despite the rain, despite having almost nothing. He wrapped the kitten inside the dry lining. "It's freezing." The guard shook his head. "You can't save every stray animal." The boy gently lifted the kitten. "Maybe not." Then he smiled. "But I can help this one." For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the guard seemed caught off guard. The boy tucked the kitten carefully against his chest, then disappeared into the rain. The alley fell silent. Inside the SUV, Ethan couldn't breathe. Not because he was scared, because something inside him was changing. He didn't have words for it. He only knew the feeling was uncomfortable, like discovering a truth he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Richard leaned back slowly. His phone sat untouched in his lap. For perhaps the first time all day, business wasn't occupying his thoughts. The boy occupied them. "Dad." Richard looked at his son. "What?" Why did he say sorry? Richard knew exactly what Ethan meant. Why apologize for looking for food? Why apologize for being poor? Why apologize for trying to survive? The answer wasn't simple, and somehow that made it worse. "Sometimes," Richard said quietly, people get treated badly for so long that they start apologizing even when they've done nothing wrong. The words lingered. Outside, the boy reached the end of the block, still carrying the kitten, still carrying the backpack, still carrying burdens Ethan couldn't imagine. The SUV followed from a distance. The city slowly changed around them. Bright storefronts disappeared. Luxury apartments gave way to aging buildings. Streetlights became fewer. Roads became rougher. Graffiti covered brick walls. Old train tracks cut through neighborhoods forgotten by most of Chicago. Yet the boy kept walking. Block after block. The rain finally eased. Night settled across the city. The glowing skyline shimmered in the distance like a different world. A world Ethan suddenly realized this boy probably never experienced. Then the boy turned into a neighborhood unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Tiny houses, broken fences, dim porch lights, rusting cars parked along cracked curbs. The kind of place people drove past without noticing. The kind of place that never appeared in magazines. The boy hurried toward a small house near the elevated train tracks. Its windows were patched with tape. The porch sagged slightly. A single yellow light glowed through the curtains. Then something happened. The moment the boy reached the front steps, the door flew open. A little girl rushed outside. She couldn't have been older than 6. She threw her arms around him. The boy smiled. A real smile. The first genuine smile Ethan had seen all day. He reached into the backpack. The little girl's eyes widened immediately. Not because she expected toys, not because she expected gifts, because she expected food. Ethan felt another painful twist in his chest. The boy wasn't collecting food for himself. He had been bringing it home. The entire time. To someone waiting. Someone depending on him. Someone who loved him. The little girl hugged him again. And for the first time that evening, Ethan realized the story was bigger than one hungry boy. Much bigger. Because behind that front door waited people Ethan had not yet met. People who might be surviving because of everything that boy sacrificed every single day. And as the train thundered overhead and rattled the neighborhood below, Ethan stared at the small house near the tracks. Something told him the hardest part of the story was waiting behind that door. And he was right. The train roared overhead. Metal wheels screamed against steel rails, shaking the old neighborhood beneath it. The sound rattled windows. It rattled loose boards. It rattled the small house standing only yards from the tracks. Yet nobody inside seemed surprised. The little girl clinging to the boy's arm barely looked up. She was used to it. That realization alone hurt Ethan more than he expected. People weren't supposed to get used to living like this. At least that's what he thought. The SUV remained parked across the street. Rainwater dripped from telephone wires. A porch light flickered weakly above the front door. The boy pushed open the screen door. The little girl followed him inside. For several seconds, Ethan stared at the house. Then he looked at his father. "Can we leave now?" The question surprised even him. A few hours earlier, he had been determined to follow the boy. Now he wasn't sure he wanted to see any more, because every answer seemed to create another painful question. Richard studied his son. "You want to go home?" Ethan looked back toward the house. "No." The answer came quietly. "I want to know." Richard nodded slowly. Neither of them moved. The front curtain shifted slightly. A shadow crossed the window. The boy was inside. The family was inside. And somehow that house felt more alive than many of the mansions Ethan had visited with his father. After a moment, Ethan opened the door. "Dad." "Ethan." "I just want to look," Richard sighed. Then, to Ethan's surprise, he stepped out too. The cold evening air wrapped around them. Together they crossed the street. The closer they got, the more details emerged. The porch steps were cracked. The paint had faded years ago. One corner of the roof had been patched with mismatched shingles, but everything was clean. Remarkably clean. The tiny flower box beneath the window held fresh soil. Someone had planted flowers there once. Someone still cared. Richard noticed it too. People who had completely given up rarely cared about flowers. A warm yellow glow spilled through the curtain. Ethan hesitated near the side of the house. Then he carefully looked through the window. What he saw made him stop breathing. The boy had emptied his backpack onto the kitchen table. Containers of food, a few apples, half a loaf of bread, several packaged salads. The rescued kitten sat inside a cardboard box lined with towels. The little girl squealed with delight. "Can we keep him?" The boy laughed softly. "We'll see." It was the first time Ethan had heard him laugh. The sound felt strange, because it didn't match the hardships he had witnessed all day, yet somehow it made him seem stronger. The little girl reached for one of the food containers. The boy gently stopped her. "Wait. Why? Let's get Mom first." "Mom." The word landed heavily. The boy disappeared down a hallway. Moments later, he returned, supporting a woman. Ethan immediately noticed how weak she looked. She couldn't have been much older than 40, but illness had carved years into her face. Her skin looked pale. Her movements were slow, painful. The little girl rushed to pull out a chair. The woman smiled. "Thank you, Lily." Lily. Now Ethan knew her name. The woman sat carefully at the table. The boy immediately opened the food containers. Not for himself, for her. Every movement was automatic, practiced, like he had done it hundreds of times. The realization hit Ethan hard. This wasn't a child helping once in a while. This was a child carrying responsibilities far beyond his age. The woman looked at the food, then at her son. "You found all this?" "Yeah. You should have kept more for yourself." "I'm fine." The answer came too quickly, too automatically. The woman knew it too. So did Ethan. So did Richard. The boy wasn't fine. He was hungry, but he smiled anyway. The little girl began eating immediately. The woman took a few bites. Then she looked at her son again. "Did you eat?" "At the shelter." A lie. A simple lie. Yet Ethan knew it instantly, because he'd watched every moment. The bus stop, the sandwich, the alley, the dumpsters, the groceries, the kitten. The boy had barely eaten all day. The woman seemed unconvinced, but she didn't push further. Perhaps because she wanted to believe him. Perhaps because mothers sometimes recognize sacrifices they don't want to acknowledge. The train thundered overhead again. The house trembled. Lily giggled. Apparently she found it funny. For a brief moment the family looked almost normal, almost peaceful. Then the woman started coughing. At first it sounded harmless. Just a cough. Then another. And another. Her body folded forward. The coughing became violent, painful. Lily froze. The smile vanished from the boy's face. "Mom?" The woman tried to answer. Couldn't. The coughs kept coming. A glass slipped from her hand. It shattered on the floor. Ethan jumped. Inside the house, panic erupted. The boy rushed to her side. "Mom!" Lily started crying. The woman struggled to breathe. One hand gripped her chest. The other clutched the edge of the table. Richard's expression changed immediately. Years of business negotiations disappeared. In their place stood a father, a human being, someone recognizing genuine distress. "We need to help." Before Ethan could answer, Richard was already moving. The front porch creaked beneath his shoes. He knocked firmly. Inside the house, everyone froze. The boy looked toward the door. Fear flashed across his face. Fear, not curiosity. Fear, as if unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. Richard knocked again. The boy slowly approached. He opened the door a few inches, then stared. A wealthy stranger stood on the porch. Behind him stood Ethan. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The woman continued coughing in the background. The little girl sobbed quietly. The boy instinctively stepped in front of them. Protective. Guarded. Ready. "Can I help you?" His voice trembled. Richard looked past him toward the struggling woman. "I think your mother needs a doctor." The boy's eyes widened, then narrowed. Suspicion. Distrust. The kind built from years of disappointment. "We're okay. No, you're not." The answer came gently, not cruelly, not judgmentally. Simply honestly. The boy swallowed. His hands tightened. For a moment, Ethan thought he might slam the door. Instead, he looked back toward his mother. Another coughing fit shook her body. Lily cried harder. The boy's brave expression cracked. Only slightly. But enough. Enough for Ethan to finally see what had been hiding underneath all day. Exhaustion. Fear. Loneliness. A 12-year-old trying desperately to hold together a family that was falling apart. And suddenly Ethan understood something. The sandwich had never been the story. The bus stop had never been the story. The dumpsters had never been the story. They were only symptoms, pieces of something much larger, much sadder. The boy looked at Richard again, then at Ethan, then back toward his mother. And for the first time all evening, he looked completely helpless. The train passed overhead once more. The house shook violently. The lights flickered, and in that fragile moment, the woman suddenly collapsed from her chair. Lily screamed. The boy lunged forward. Richard moved instantly, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped, because he knew everything was about to change. "Mom!" Malik dropped to his knees beside Grace. The chair tipped backward and clattered against the kitchen floor. Lily screamed and rushed toward her mother. For one terrifying second, nobody moved. Then Richard Walker stepped through the doorway. Years of running a billion-dollar company had trained him to make decisions quickly. This wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a business crisis. But he recognized urgency when he saw it. "Call 911, he said immediately. Ethan fumbled for his phone. His hands shook. Everything felt unreal. Just hours ago, he had been arguing about a sandwich. Now he was standing inside a tiny house beneath train tracks, watching a family fight through a crisis he couldn't begin to understand. Grace struggled to breathe. Her chest rose and fell unevenly. Malik gently supported her shoulders. "Mom, stay with me." His voice cracked. The brave face he'd worn all day was gone. Now he looked like what he really was, a frightened 12-year-old boy. Lily clung to Grace's arm. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Mommy?" Grace managed to open her eyes. Only slightly. "It's okay, baby." But it clearly wasn't okay. Richard knelt beside them. "Has this happened before?" Malik nodded. "A few times." "A few times." The answer stunned him. Why wasn't she taken to a hospital? The question slipped out before he could stop it. Malik lowered his eyes. The silence told the story. Money. The answer was money. The house trembled as another train thundered overhead. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then distant sirens echoed through the neighborhood. Relief washed over Ethan. They're coming. Malik didn't look relieved. He looked terrified. Richard noticed immediately. What is it? They'll ask for insurance. Richard stared at him. What? Malik swallowed. We don't have any. The words hung heavily in the room. Ethan felt something twist inside him. He had never once wondered whether his family had insurance. He had never worried about hospital bills. He had never thought twice about seeing a doctor. Malik had, apparently every day. Minutes later, paramedics arrived. The small house filled with flashing lights and hurried voices. Grace was examined carefully. Questions were asked. Vitals checked. Equipment unpacked. The lead paramedic finally looked at Grace. We need to take her in. Malik immediately stood. I'm coming too, the paramedic nodded. Of course. Then he glanced toward Lily. Who stays with her? The room fell silent. Malik froze. Grace was going to the hospital. But Lily couldn't stay alone. The realization hit all at once. There was no father, no grandparents, no relatives rushing through the door, no support system. Only Malik, only a 12-year-old boy carrying responsibilities meant for adults. Richard looked at Lily, then at Malik, then at Ethan. And suddenly he understood something that made him uncomfortable. This family wasn't struggling because they lacked effort. They were struggling despite tremendous effort. Malik was already doing everything he possibly could. The problem was bigger than hard work. Much bigger. I'll stay with her. Everyone looked at Richard. Even Ethan. The billionaire's words seemed almost absurd inside the tiny kitchen. Malik blinked. What? You go with your mother. The boy looked uncertain, suspicious, like someone expecting a catch. You don't even know us. Richard nodded. That's true. Then why would you help? The question lingered. Richard didn't answer immediately, because the truth surprised even him. Finally, he looked at the boy. Because someone should. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the rain tapping softly against the windows. Then Grace reached out weakly. Her hand found Malik's. Go. I don't want to leave Lily. Grace smiled faintly. You take care of me. She glanced toward Richard. Let someone help take care of her. The words seemed to break something inside Malik. The wall he'd been holding up all day finally cracked. Not completely. Just enough. Enough to reveal how exhausted he really was. The paramedics carefully helped Grace onto a stretcher. Lily cried harder. Malik hugged her tightly. I'll be back. Promise? I promise. Then he kissed her forehead. The gesture was so natural, so protective, that Ethan suddenly remembered something. He couldn't remember the last time he'd protected anyone. The thought made him uncomfortable. Outside, flashing lights painted the wet street red and blue. Neighbors peeked through curtains. A few stood beneath porches watching. Most already knew the Johnson family. Most knew their struggles. But knowing and helping weren't always the same thing. The ambulance doors closed. Grace and Malik climbed inside. As the vehicle pulled away, Lily stood by the window watching. The taillights disappeared into the darkness. Then the little girl quietly sat on the couch. The house suddenly felt empty. Too quiet. Too fragile. Richard looked around. The peeling paint. The patched furniture. The carefully folded blankets. Everything told the same story. A family surviving one day at a time. Not because they lacked dignity, but because life had become too heavy. Ethan wandered toward the kitchen table. The food Malik had collected still sat there, half-eaten, carefully arranged, nothing wasted. He stared at the leftovers. A memory flashed through his mind, Mrs. Carter kneeling on the restaurant floor, the sandwich he'd thrown away, the sound of the plate shattering, the embarrassment he'd ignored, the waste. Suddenly he wished he could take that moment back. Lily's small voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are you rich?" Ethan turned. The question caught him off guard. "A little." Richard laughed quietly from across the room. "A little?" Lily looked confused. "My brother says rich people live in houses with movie theaters." Ethan nodded awkwardly. "We have one." Her eyes widened. Then she smiled. Not jealous, just amazed. The innocence made Ethan feel even worse, because despite everything she lacked, she still seemed kinder than he had been all day. Richard checked his phone. Hospital updates hadn't arrived yet. He paced slowly through the room. Then he noticed something framed on a shelf. A photograph. He picked it up. A man stood smiling beside Grace, one arm around Malik, the other around a much younger Lily. The father. Richard studied the image. The man's expression carried confidence, pride, purpose. He didn't look like someone who abandoned his family. He looked like someone who had loved them deeply. "What happened to him?" Richard asked quietly. Lily's smile faded. "He went to heaven." The answer was simple, childlike, painfully direct. Richard carefully set the photo down. Something about that picture unsettled him. Questions began forming, questions he couldn't yet answer. Who had this man been? What had happened to this family? How had things become so difficult? And why did it feel like the answers were hiding somewhere just beyond reach? Hours later, Richard drove Ethan toward the hospital. The city lights blurred against rain-covered windows. Neither spoke much. Both were lost in thought. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Dad." "Yeah?" "We have to help them." Richard stared ahead. His jaw tightened. The businessman inside him wanted solutions, donations, checks, resources, simple answers. But tonight didn't feel simple. "No one should have to live like that," Ethan said quietly. Richard nodded. "I know, but money won't fix everything." The words surprised both of them, because they came from Ethan, not Richard. For years, Ethan had believed money fixed everything. Tonight, he was beginning to learn otherwise. When they reached the hospital, they found Malik sitting alone in a waiting room chair. His backpack rested beside him. His eyes looked exhausted, but he stood immediately when he saw them. "How is she?" Richard asked. Malik hesitated. The fear returned to his face. "The doctors are helping her." Then he looked away. "There are problems." "What kind of problems?" Malik swallowed. The answer came softly. "They said her insurance was canceled months ago." Richard's expression darkened. "Canceled?" Malik nodded. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The waiting room suddenly felt colder, and deep inside, Richard Walker sensed that this family's story was about to become much more complicated than anyone imagined. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nurses moved through the hallway. A television mounted in the corner played silently while captions rolled across the screen. But none of that held anyone's attention. Malik sat rigidly in a plastic chair. His backpack rested at his feet. The same backpack Ethan had seen at the bus stop. The same backpack he had seen behind the grocery store. The same backpack that somehow carried food, responsibility, and the weight of an entire family. Now it looked heavier than ever. "What do you mean her insurance was canceled?" Richard asked. Malik rubbed his hands together. "I don't know, no, Nobody explained it? They sent letters. What letters? Malik looked embarrassed. The expression broke Richard's heart. We moved 3 times. The answer came quietly. Sometimes we didn't get our mail. Richard looked away. A billionaire accustomed to solving problems with a phone call suddenly found himself speechless. How many things had to go wrong before a family ended up here? How many setbacks? How many missed opportunities? How many closed doors? Across from them, Ethan watched Malik carefully. For the first time all day, the 2 boys sat close enough to really see each other. Not through a window, not from a distance, face to face. You should eat something, Ethan said. Malik looked surprised. What? You haven't eaten. I'm okay. It was the same lie Ethan had heard earlier. The same lie he'd heard inside the house. The same lie Malik probably told every day. Ethan opened a vending machine snack he'd bought downstairs and held it out. Malik hesitated. His pride fought with his hunger. Finally, he accepted it. Thanks. The gratitude in his voice felt larger than the snack itself, and Ethan suddenly remembered all the times he had complained about food, all the meals he'd left unfinished, all the things he'd taken for granted. The memory made him uncomfortable. A doctor finally emerged from the hallway. Everyone stood. Family of Grace Johnson? Malik stepped forward instantly. I'm her son. The doctor smiled gently. Your mother is stable. Relief flooded the room. Malik's shoulders dropped. Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Richard nodded gratefully, but the doctor wasn't finished. She needs ongoing treatment. The relief immediately weakened. How much treatment? Malik asked. The doctor hesitated. Then he chose his words carefully. Quite a bit. Silence followed. Everyone understood what he meant. Money, medicine, specialists, tests. Things that cost more than this family could possibly afford. The doctor looked at Richard. You'll need to speak with billing in the morning. Richard's expression hardened slightly. Don't worry about billing. The doctor recognized him immediately. Most people did. Mr. Walker? Richard simply nodded. I'll handle it. The doctor seemed relieved. Then he returned down the hallway. Malik stared. For a moment he looked almost angry. Not grateful. Not relieved. Angry. Richard noticed. What is it? Malik looked away. Nothing. No. What is it? The boy hesitated. Finally, he spoke. People always say they'll help. The words landed harder than Richard expected. The waiting room became very quiet. What do you mean? Malik stared at the floor. When my mom got sick, people promised things. His voice remained calm, but the pain underneath it was impossible to miss. A church fundraiser, a city program, a guy who said he'd help with medicine. He swallowed. Most of them disappeared. The honesty stunned Ethan. Nobody spoke, because nobody could argue with him. Richard sat beside the boy. For the first time all evening, he wasn't sitting beside investors or executives. He was sitting beside a child who had learned not to trust hope, and that realization hurt. I'm sorry. Malik looked surprised. Richard rarely apologized. People usually apologized to him, not the other way around. I'm not those people, Richard said quietly. Malik didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. A small step, nothing more. Hours later, the hospital arranged a room for Grace. Lily had fallen asleep against Ethan's shoulder. The little girl trusted people far more easily than her brother. Eventually, Richard insisted everyone get some rest. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Chicago's skyline disappeared behind low clouds. Rain streaked the hospital windows. Richard arrived carrying coffee. And questions. Lots of questions. While Grace rested, he met with a nurse who had worked at the hospital for years. The woman reviewed Grace's chart, then paused. Grace Johnson. Something in her voice changed. You know her? The nurse smiled sadly. Everybody knew Grace. Richard frowned. What do you mean? The nurse leaned back. 10 years ago, she worked here. Richard blinked. Here? The nurse nodded. One of the best nurses we ever had. The statement surprised him. Very little about Grace's current situation suggested that history. The nurse continued. She worked double shifts, covered holidays, stayed late when other people went home. Patients loved her. Richard listened carefully. The image forming in his mind didn't match the assumptions many people would make. This wasn't someone who had spent years avoiding responsibility. This wasn't someone waiting for rescue. This was someone who had built a life. Someone respected. Someone valuable. What happened? The nurse's smile faded. Life. One word. Yet it carried enormous weight. The nurse glanced toward Grace's room. Her husband died. Medical bills piled up. Then she got sick herself. Richard remained silent. The nurse shook her head. I still can't believe it. What? Seeing her struggle? The woman looked genuinely saddened. Good people aren't supposed to end up like this. The statement followed Richard long after the conversation ended. Good people aren't supposed to end up like this. Yet somehow they did. Every day. Later that afternoon, Richard stood outside Grace's hospital room. Inside, Malik sat beside his mother. Lily-colored pictures with crayons a volunteer had brought. The scene looked peaceful, fragile, temporary. Grace noticed Richard first. She smiled weakly. You helped my children. Richard stepped inside. They would have done the same for someone else. Grace looked toward Malik. A look passed between them. One only family could understand. Then she laughed softly. That sounds like him. Malik lowered his eyes, embarrassed. Richard found himself smiling. For all the hardship he'd witnessed, one thing remained remarkably intact. Kindness. Not because life had been easy, but despite the fact that it hadn't. Then Grace said something unexpected. My husband was like that too. Richard paused. Marcus? Her eyes widened. How do you know his name? Richard glanced toward the family photo sitting on the bedside table. Grace followed his gaze. The room grew quiet. Outside the window, rain continued falling over Chicago. Inside, a different storm was beginning. Because Richard Walker had started asking questions. Questions about Marcus Johnson. Questions about the past. Questions that would soon lead him somewhere none of them expected. And for the first time since stepping into that small house beneath the train tracks, he had the unmistakable feeling that Grace Johnson's illness wasn't the real mystery. The real mystery had died years earlier, and somehow it was connected to his own world. That thought followed Richard Walker all the way back to his office. The next morning, Chicago woke beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Rain streaked the windows of Walker Technologies headquarters. Employees hurried through revolving doors carrying coffee and laptops. Inside the 42nd floor executive suite, Richard stood alone before a wall of glass overlooking the city. Normally his mornings began with financial reports, acquisition meetings, shareholder calls. Today, none of those things mattered. Instead, he found himself staring at a photograph on his phone, a picture he had taken in Grace Johnson's hospital room. The family photo. Marcus Johnson. The man with the easy smile. The man who looked proud of his family. The man whose name refused to leave Richard's mind. A knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside. "You have the quarterly review in 20 minutes. Cancel it." The woman blinked. "Sir?" "Move it to tomorrow. Tomorrow is full. Then make room." She stared for a moment. Richard Walker almost never canceled meetings, yet something in his expression convinced her not to argue. As soon as she left, Richard opened the internal company database. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Marcus Johnson. Hundreds of names appeared. He narrowed the search. Former employees. Engineering division. Chicago. A moment later, the screen refreshed. One result remained. Marcus Elijah Johnson. Richard sat up straighter. The employee file opened. Position, Logistics Systems Engineer. Years employed, 8. Performance reviews, excellent. Leadership evaluations, outstanding. Disciplinary actions, none. Richard frowned. Nothing about the file suggested failure. Nothing explained why a respected engineer's family had ended up living beside train tracks. Then he reached the final entry. Employment status, terminated. The date was 5 years earlier. Richard clicked deeper. The explanation appeared. Violation of company policy. Investigation closed. Case archived. Richard frowned harder. The wording felt strangely vague. Very vague. Most termination records contained details, witness reports, documentation, specific findings. This file contained almost nothing, just enough information to close the case, not enough to explain it. Richard picked up the phone. "Get me every archived file connected to Marcus Johnson. Today? Immediately." The assistant hesitated. "That could take hours. Then start now." He hung up. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Meanwhile, across the city, Malik sat beside his mother's hospital bed. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds. Grace looked better than she had the night before. Not healthy, but stable. For the first time in weeks, some color had returned to her face. Lily sat nearby drawing pictures. One showed their family. Another showed the orange kitten. The third showed a large house. A very large house. Grace smiled. "What's that one?" Lily pointed proudly. "Ethan's house." Malik laughed softly. "You've never seen Ethan's house." "I know, but rich people always have huge houses." Grace shook her head, amused. Then her smile faded slightly. "How's Ethan?" Malik looked surprised. "Why are you asking?" "Because he stayed." The answer came quietly. "He could have gone home." Malik glanced toward the window. The city skyline shimmered in the distance. "I don't know." Grace studied her son. "You like him?" Malik immediately shook his head. "No." The answer came far too quickly. Grace laughed. "That's exactly what someone says when they do." Malik rolled his eyes. But secretly, he knew something had changed. Not long ago, he would have assumed Ethan was like every other rich kid he'd encountered. Entitled, dismissive, disconnected. Instead, Ethan had followed him, helped him, shared his concern. And somehow that made Malik uncomfortable. Because hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. He had learned that lesson many times. Back at Walker Technologies, several cardboard archive boxes arrived shortly after noon. Richard dismissed everyone from his office. Then he began reading. Old reports, internal emails, performance reviews, project documents. For hours he found nothing unusual. Then he discovered a file marked confidential. The date matched Marcus Johnson's termination. Richard opened it. Inside sat dozens of pages. Many were missing. Several had been removed. Others appeared incomplete. His pulse quickened. Why would someone alter an archived investigation? The answer disturbed him. Because someone wanted part of the story hidden. He continued reading. Names surfaced repeatedly. Executives, managers, legal staff. Then one name appeared more often than all the others. Harold Pierce. Richard froze. Harold Pierce was currently the company's chief operating officer, a man widely expected to become the next CEO, a man Richard had trusted for years. The file revealed something strange. Every complaint Marcus submitted involved Harold. Every report, every concern, every warning. Marcus had repeatedly accused someone of redirecting company funds and manipulating project records. The allegations had been dismissed. Case closed. Employee terminated. End of story. Except it clearly wasn't. Richard leaned back slowly. The city skyline blurred beyond the windows. For the first time, he began wondering whether Marcus Johnson had been telling the truth. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Ethan entered carrying a backpack. No expensive sneakers today. No complaints. No talk about drones. He looked different. Tired. Thoughtful. Older somehow. "Hey, Dad." Richard smiled faintly. "How was school?" "Boring." He paused. "Can we visit the hospital later?" The question surprised Richard. "You want to?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah." Richard looked at his son for several seconds. Only a few days earlier, Ethan had cared about almost nothing beyond himself. Now he was worried about someone else. Someone he'd never met before this week. The transformation was impossible to ignore. "What happened at school?" Ethan shrugged. "Nothing." Then he looked down. "Actually, something." Richard waited. At last Ethan spoke. One kid threw away his lunch because it wasn't what he wanted. Richard remained silent. "I got mad." Ethan stared at the floor. "I almost yelled at him." The confession hung between them. Slowly Richard smiled, because he understood. Ethan wasn't angry at the boy. He was angry at the version of himself he used to be, and maybe still was. That's called learning. Ethan looked up. "It feels terrible." Richard nodded. "It usually does." Late that afternoon, father and son arrived at the hospital. Lily immediately ran toward Ethan. The little girl held up a drawing. "Look." It showed 4 stick figures. Grace, Lily, Malik, Ethan. The sight made Ethan laugh. "Where's your mom?" Lily pointed. "She's resting." Malik emerged from the hallway carrying snacks from a vending machine. When he spotted Ethan, he smiled slightly. The gesture lasted less than a second, but it was genuine. And Ethan noticed. For the first time. They weren't strangers anymore. While the boys talked quietly, Richard stepped into Grace's room. She was awake. Reading, or at least trying to. The book rested unopened in her lap. She already knew something was troubling him. "I've seen that look before." Richard pulled up a chair. "What look?" "The one that says you're chasing answers." For a moment he almost laughed. Then he became serious. "Grace." She looked up. What really happened to Marcus? The room grew very quiet, Outside, a helicopter crossed the skyline. Inside, Grace stared at him. A shadow passed through her eyes. Pain. Old pain. The kind that never completely leaves. He tried to do the right thing. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He always did. Richard waited. Grace swallowed. Then she looked toward the family photograph sitting beside the hospital bed. The same photograph he had seen before. The same smile. The same family. He found something at work. Richard felt his pulse quicken. What kind of something? Grace looked directly at him. The kind that got him fired. Silence filled the room. Then she added 6 words that made Richard's blood run cold. And maybe got him killed, too. The city lights flickered on beyond the hospital windows. Night settled over Chicago. And for the first time, Richard realized this wasn't just a story about a struggling family. It was a story about a buried truth. A truth someone had worked very hard to keep hidden. And the closer he got to Marcus Johnson's past, the more dangerous that truth began to feel. For the next several days, Richard Walker found himself thinking about Marcus Johnson far more than quarterly earnings reports. The feeling was strange, uncomfortable. He had built his career by focusing on numbers, strategies, and outcomes. Yet now a dead engineer occupied his thoughts. A man he had never met. A man whose family had somehow wandered into his life through a hungry boy carrying a sandwich. Outside, Chicago's autumn wind swept fallen leaves through the streets. Inside Grace Johnson's hospital room, small signs of recovery began to appear. Her color improved. Her breathing stabilized. Her smile returned more often. Not fully, but enough. Enough to give her children hope. And hope changed everything. One afternoon, Malik stood by the hospital window watching traffic below. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't worrying about finding dinner. For the first time in months, he wasn't calculating which bill could be ignored for another week. For the first time in years, someone else was helping carry the weight. The feeling felt unfamiliar, almost frightening. Behind him, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor drawing. She held up another picture. Look. Malik turned. The drawing showed Ethan again, this time standing beside him, both smiling. A giant orange cat sat between them. The kitten got bigger. Lily nodded proudly. He's famous now. Malik laughed. The kitten had become a regular topic of conversation. Ethan had even helped buy food for it. The memory made him smile. Then the hospital room door opened. Richard entered carrying a leather portfolio. His expression looked serious. Very serious. Grace noticed immediately. What happened? Richard sat down. For a moment, he simply stared at the folder. Then he looked at Malik. I need your help. The boy frowned. My help. Richard nodded. Your father's things. What things? The things he left behind. Silence filled the room. Marcus Johnson rarely came up in conversation. Not because they had forgotten him, because remembering still hurt. Grace slowly reached toward the bedside drawer. Inside sat a key. Small. Old. Worn from years of use. She handed it to Richard. The garage. Richard looked confused. What garage? The storage unit. Grace smiled sadly. We couldn't afford to keep much. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. But I couldn't throw away Marcus's work. Malik immediately understood. The storage unit. The place his mother almost never discussed. The place where his father's boxes had sat untouched for years. The place where memories waited. An hour later, they arrived at a self-storage facility on Chicago's South Side. Gray fences surrounded rows of metal units. Cold wind swept across cracked pavement. The place looked forgotten. Unit 147. Grace's key fit perfectly. The door rolled upward with a metallic groan. Dust filled the air. Sunlight spilled across stacks of boxes. Old furniture, tool chests, photographs, and memories. Lots of memories. Malik stepped inside first. His footsteps echoed softly. Everything smelled like cardboard and time. Lily wandered carefully among the boxes. Then she spotted something. Daddy's bike. A rusted bicycle leaned against the wall. Marcus's bicycle, the one he used to ride to work. Grace looked away. The sight hurt too much. Richard began sorting through boxes, employee records, tax forms, family albums, engineering notebooks. The deeper they searched, the more Marcus came alive. Not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as a man, a father, a dreamer. Then Malik found something. A shoebox. Old, dust-covered, taped shut. His heart skipped. He recognized it instantly. His father used to keep important things inside it. Carefully, he opened the lid. Inside sat dozens of documents, handwritten notes, technical drawings, blueprints, design sketches. Richard's eyes widened. He immediately recognized the material. These weren't random papers. They were logistics designs, advanced ones, years ahead of their time. Richard slowly lifted one page, then another, then another. The more he examined them, the more stunned he became. Marcus Johnson hadn't simply been an engineer. He had been brilliant. Some of the ideas resembled systems Walker Technologies currently used. The realization made Richard's stomach tighten. Very few people could create concepts at this level. Then why had Marcus been fired? The question grew louder, more disturbing. Before Richard could continue, another item caught Malik's attention. A faded photograph. Marcus stood beside several coworkers. Everyone wore company badges. Everyone smiled. Except one man, a tall executive standing near the center. The man's expression looked cold, controlled, almost annoyed. Richard froze. He knew that face. Harold Pierce, the current chief operating officer, the man whose name kept appearing throughout the archived reports. Richard carefully took the photograph. His pulse quickened. The pieces were beginning to connect, and he didn't like what he was seeing. Then Lily pointed toward another box. "What's this?" Inside sat dozens of awards, certificates, recognition plaques, employee achievement medals. Malik stared. His father had never talked much about work. He had no idea there were so many. Richard picked up one plaque. Outstanding Innovation Award. Marcus Johnson. Another. Engineering Excellence Recognition. Marcus Johnson. Another. Leadership Achievement. Marcus Johnson. The room fell silent, because one truth had become impossible to ignore. Marcus wasn't some disgruntled employee. He wasn't mediocre. He wasn't a troublemaker. He had been one of the company's most valuable people. The realization made his termination even less believable. Hours later, Richard requested something unusual. He wanted Malik and Lily to accompany him downtown, to company headquarters. "We need to verify some things." Malik immediately looked uncomfortable. "At your office?" Richard nodded. The boy hesitated. Corporate buildings weren't places people like him usually entered. At least that's what life had taught him. The next morning they arrived. Walker Technologies towered above downtown Chicago. Glass walls reflected sunlight. Employees hurried through revolving doors. Luxury cars lined the curb. Everything felt worlds away from the neighborhood beneath the train tracks. Malik instinctively adjusted his worn hoodie. Lily gripped his hand. Ethan joined them at the entrance. "You ready?" Malik wasn't, but he nodded anyway. The lobby stretched upward several stories. Marble floors gleamed. Water features flowed quietly along polished walls. People in suits moved confidently through security checkpoints. Then it happened. The moment Malik had secretly expected. The receptionist looked at him, then at Lily, then at their clothes. Her smile disappeared. "Can I help you?" The tone had changed, subtly, but unmistakably. "We're here with Mr. Walker," Ethan said. The receptionist barely glanced at him. Her attention remained fixed on Malik. "Do you have an appointment?" Richard had stepped away to take a call. He wasn't there. Not yet. The receptionist folded her arms. Several nearby employees looked over. One security guard slowly approached. The familiar feeling returned. The same feeling Malik experienced at the grocery store, at the bus stop, in certain neighborhoods, in certain stores. The feeling of not belonging, of being judged before speaking, of being seen as a problem instead of a person. Lily moved closer to him. Even she felt it. The guard stopped nearby. "Everything okay here?" The receptionist answered before Malik could. "They say they're here for Mr. Walker." The word "say" carried all the doubt necessary. Malik lowered his eyes. Not because he was guilty, because he was tired. Tired of proving himself. Tired of explaining himself. Tired of being looked at that way. Then another voice cut through the lobby. Clear, confident, immediate. "He's with me." Everyone turned. Ethan Walker stepped forward. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The billionaire's son stood directly beside Malik. Not behind him, not observing from a distance. Beside him. The receptionist blinked. The security guard froze. Ethan looked straight at them. "He's with me." This time his voice carried even more certainty. The lobby became silent, and for the first time since entering the building, Malik felt something unexpected. Protected. But neither boy noticed someone else watching from across the lobby. A senior executive had just emerged from the elevators. His gaze drifted toward the documents Malik carried, toward one specific blueprint partially visible inside the folder. The man's face immediately lost color. He stopped walking, stopped breathing, stopped smiling, because he recognized the name written across the top. Marcus Johnson. And suddenly, he looked terrified. The reaction lasted less than a second, a brief flicker across the executive's face. So brief that most people would have missed it. Richard Walker didn't. Years of negotiating billion-dollar deals had taught him how to read people. He knew the difference between surprise and fear. This wasn't surprise. This was fear. Pure fear. The executive quickly recovered. Too quickly. His expression returned to normal. His posture straightened. His professional smile reappeared. But the damage was done. Richard had seen it. The man crossed the lobby and disappeared toward the elevators. Richard's eyes followed him. "Who was that?" Ethan asked. Richard didn't answer immediately, because he already knew. Harold Pierce, Chief Operating Officer. The same name that had appeared throughout Marcus Johnson's files. The same name Grace had indirectly connected to her husband's downfall. The same name attached to every missing report and incomplete investigation. And now Harold Pierce had just reacted to Marcus Johnson's name like he'd seen a ghost. That wasn't a coincidence. Not anymore. Hours later, Richard sat in a conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. The city stretched beyond the glass walls. Gray skies hung low above the water. Inside, tension filled the room. Harold Pierce sat across from him. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect confidence, at least on the surface. Richard placed Marcus's blueprint on the table. Harold's eyes immediately found it. A subtle mistake. One he couldn't hide. You recognize this? Harold smiled politely. Should I? Richard leaned back. The silence stretched. Then Harold shrugged. Looks like an old engineering drawing. Marcus Johnson's drawing. The smile vanished. Only briefly. But long enough. Richard saw it again. Fear. Harold folded his hands. I vaguely remember him. The answer sounded rehearsed. Too smooth. Too careful. Richard opened a folder. Interesting. Harold remained silent. Because your name appears in nearly every file connected to his termination. For the first time, genuine discomfort entered the room. Harold shifted slightly. Marcus had performance issues. Richard stared at him. No. The single word landed heavily. Harold blinked. Richard slid several performance reviews across the table. Outstanding. Exceptional. Leadership potential. Innovation awards. Every document told the same story. Marcus Johnson had been one of the company's best employees. Harold's jaw tightened. Those reviews don't tell the whole story. Then tell me the whole story. Silence. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Inside, neither man moved. Finally, Harold spoke. Marcus became difficult. Difficult? He made accusations. What kind of accusations? Harold looked away briefly, then back. The kind disgruntled employees make. Richard didn't buy it. Not for a second. Because he'd spent enough time around Malik to understand something important. Marcus Johnson's family wasn't filled with bitterness. They weren't opportunists. They weren't chasing money. If anything, they had accepted suffering with more dignity than most wealthy people accepted success. Nothing about them matched Harold's version of events. Richard closed the folder. We're reopening the investigation. The color drained slightly from Harold's face. What? We're reviewing everything. Why? Richard's voice hardened. Because I own this company. The meeting ended minutes later, but the story didn't, not even close. That evening, Richard returned to the hospital. The Johnson family sat together eating dinner. Real dinner, hot dinner, not leftovers from dumpsters, not half sandwiches, not whatever could be found. A proper meal. Grace smiled when she saw him. Long day? Richard laughed softly. You have no idea. Malik noticed something immediately. Richard looked different. Focused. Determined. The way people look when they've decided something. What happened? Richard sat down. For a moment, he simply looked at Marcus's family. The family Marcus had spent his life protecting. Then he spoke. I met Harold Pierce. The room became still. Grace's smile vanished. Malik frowned. The name clearly meant something. A lot. Grace lowered her fork slowly. What did he say? Not much. The answer came honestly, but what he didn't say was more important. Grace looked away. Pain crossed her face. Old pain. The kind that never completely heals. Marcus hated him. Richard remained silent. She continued. Not because Harold was his boss. Her fingers tightened around the napkin. Because Marcus believed Harold was stealing. The room grew quiet. Even Lily stopped eating. Grace rarely talked about those years. Stealing what? Ethan asked. Grace hesitated, then finally answered. Credit. The word seemed strangely small, yet somehow enormous. Marcus designed systems. She looked toward Malik. Really good systems. Richard nodded. The blueprints confirmed that. One day he came home angry. Grace's eyes drifted toward the window, as if watching the memory unfold. He said someone was taking his work, someone higher up, someone powerful. Nobody needed clarification. Everyone knew who she meant. Did he have proof? Richard asked. Grace nodded. He said he did. The answer sent a chill through Richard, because if Marcus had proof, where was it? Grace sighed. He kept everything. Richard sat forward. What does that mean? He never threw anything away. The billionaire froze. His mind immediately raced through possibilities. Boxes, files, storage units, blueprints, evidence. Then Malik suddenly spoke. There might be more. Everyone turned. The boy looked uncertain. In the shoebox. The one with the drawings. Grace frowned. What shoebox? The old one Dad always carried. Recognition flashed across her face. Oh. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Malik continued. I never looked through everything. The words changed the atmosphere instantly, because suddenly the possibility existed. Not suspicion, not guesses, not theories. Evidence. Real evidence. The next morning, they returned to the storage unit. Cold air filled the facility. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. The familiar boxes waited. Quiet. Forgotten. Until now. Malik found the shoebox quickly. It sat exactly where he'd left it. Richard carefully placed it on a folding table. Everyone gathered around. Grace, Malik, Ethan. Even Lily watched. Slowly they removed the contents. Blueprints, notes, sketches, calculations, letters, more letters, and then something unexpected. An old USB drive. Tiny, black, ordinary, yet somehow it felt important. Very important. Malik stared. I've never seen that before. Neither had Grace. Richard picked it up carefully. The room suddenly felt smaller, the silence heavier, because instinct told him this wasn't random. Marcus Johnson had kept this hidden for a reason. A very good reason. Richard looked at the faded label attached to the side. The handwriting was worn, almost unreadable, but one word remained visible. Evidence. Nobody spoke. Not even Lily. Because somehow everyone understood. Whatever was stored on that drive might finally explain everything. Richard slipped the USB into his pocket. His heartbeat quickened. Years of buried questions suddenly felt closer to answers. Outside, a train horn echoed somewhere across the city. Inside the storage unit, a family stood on the edge of a truth they had waited years to uncover, and none of them were prepared for what they were about to hear. The drive was so small, so ordinary. A simple black USB stick no larger than a thumb. Yet everyone in the room stared at it as if it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Maybe it did. Outside the storage facility, traffic hummed in the distance. A freight train rolled somewhere across Chicago's south side. Inside Unit 147, nobody spoke. Richard finally broke the silence. We need a computer. 30 minutes later, they gathered in a private conference room at Walker Technologies. The room overlooked the city skyline. Clouds drifted slowly above Lake Michigan. Normally, executives met here to discuss million-dollar contracts. Today, the room held something far more important. Grace sat beside Malik. Lily leaned against her mother's shoulder. Ethan sat quietly across from them. No one touched the snacks placed on the table. No one checked their phones. Richard inserted the USB drive. For a moment, nothing happened. Then folders appeared on the screen. Documents, spreadsheets, emails, photographs, audio files, hundreds of files. The room fell silent. Marcus Johnson hadn't simply saved evidence, he had preserved an entire story. Richard opened the first folder. Internal reports appeared, project evaluations, budget records, design submissions. Each document seemed connected to a logistics platform Marcus had been developing years earlier. Richard's eyes widened. He recognized parts of it immediately. Not because he had seen Marcus's version, because Walker Technologies was currently using similar systems. Systems generating millions of dollars every year. Systems credited to someone else. Harold Pierce. The realization sent a chill through the room. Malik didn't fully understand the technical details, but he understood one thing. His father's name wasn't on work that clearly belonged to him. Richard opened another file. Emails filled the screen. Message after message. Marcus reporting discrepancies. Marcus questioning missing funds. Marcus raising concerns. Marcus asking for investigations. Each time the responses followed the same pattern. Dismissed, ignored, delayed, buried. The room grew heavier. Grace covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. For years she had believed Marcus. But believing and proving were different things. Now proof sat directly in front of her, and it hurt. Because every page confirmed something terrible. Marcus had been telling the truth. Then Richard found a folder labeled Final. The title alone made everyone uneasy. Inside sat a single audio file. Nothing else. Just one recording. The timestamp showed it had been created 3 days before Marcus died. Nobody spoke. Richard moved the cursor toward the file. His hand hesitated. Grace looked away. Malik stared at the screen. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Somehow they all knew this was different. This wasn't evidence. This was personal. Richard clicked play. Static filled the speakers. A few seconds passed. Then a voice emerged. Warm, calm, gentle, testing. The room froze. Grace immediately covered her mouth. Lily looked confused. Malik stopped breathing, because even after all these years, he recognized it. His father's voice. Marcus Johnson. Alive again. Not through photographs. Not through memories. Through sound. The effect was overwhelming. The recording continued. If you're listening to this, something has gone wrong. Nobody moved. The city skyline stood motionless beyond the windows. Even the clouds seemed frozen. Marcus sighed softly. I hope I'm being paranoid. A nervous laugh followed. But if you're hearing this, I probably wasn't. Grace began crying quietly. Malik stared at the screen, unable to blink, unable to look away. The voice continued. I found evidence that project funds were redirected. A pause. I reported it. Another pause. And now people are telling me to stop asking questions. Richard felt his jaw tighten. The room had become ice cold. Marcus continued. I'm leaving copies of everything. The recording crackled briefly. Then his voice returned. If something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. The weight of those words pressed down on everyone. Then Marcus said a name, the name they had all expected. Harold Pierce. The room erupted into silence. Not shock. Confirmation. The kind that hurts more than surprise, because deep down they already knew. Marcus continued speaking. He described meetings, threats, pressure, manipulated reports, missing funds, stolen project designs, everything, piece by piece, patiently, clearly. The evidence was devastating. Richard's face darkened with every minute. The more he listened, the angrier he became. Not because of money, not because of the company, because a good man had been destroyed. A good man had tried to do the right thing, and nobody had listened. Then the recording changed. The business details faded. The professional tone disappeared. Marcus became something else. A husband. A father. The room felt smaller, more intimate, as if everyone had suddenly been invited into a private conversation. If Grace is hearing this, his voice softened. I love you. Grace broke completely. Years of grief crashed through her defenses. She lowered her head and cried openly. Lily wrapped her arms around her mother. Malik stared at the speaker. Frozen. Marcus continued. You were always stronger than me. Grace laughed through tears, the exact words he used to tell her. Every anniversary, every birthday, every difficult moment. Then came another pause. Longer this time. And when Marcus spoke again, his voice trembled slightly. As for my children, Malik immediately sat forward. The room seemed to hold its breath. Malik. The name echoed through the speakers. The boy's eyes filled instantly. If you're old enough to understand this. Marcus paused. Then I'm sorry I wasn't there. Nobody could speak. The pain in the room became almost tangible. Marcus continued. You'll probably feel angry. You'll probably feel hurt. You might even feel alone. Tears rolled down Malik's face. For years he had felt exactly those things. Every single one. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that silenced the room. The sentence nobody would ever forget. Malik, if one day you hear this, don't let the world make you stop being kind. The words hung in the air, heavy, beautiful, heartbreaking. Ethan lowered his head. Richard closed his eyes. Grace cried harder, because somehow Marcus had described his son perfectly, despite the hunger, despite the humiliation, despite the dumpsters, despite the poverty. Malik had remained kind, exactly as his father hoped. The recording continued for a few more moments. Marcus spoke to Lily, spoke to Grace, spoke about faith, about hope, about truth. Then it ended. Silence filled the conference room. Nobody moved. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls. Cars moved below. People lived their lives. Yet inside this room everything had changed. Several minutes passed before anyone spoke. Finally Richard stood. His voice was quiet, controlled, but underneath it burned something fierce. Anger, determination, justice. He looked directly at Grace, then at Malik, then at the screen. I should have found this years ago. Nobody argued. Because he was right. Richard took a deep breath, then reached for his phone. What are you doing? Ethan asked. Richard's eyes never left the evidence. His answer came immediately. I'm calling legal. Another call. And compliance. Another. And the board. The room understood. This wasn't an investigation anymore. This was accountability. Real accountability. For the first time in years, the truth finally had a voice, and this time people were listening. Hours later, after attorneys reviewed the files, Richard stood alone in his office. Night had fallen over Chicago. The city glowed beneath him. His phone rang. The caller ID displayed one name, Harold Pierce. Richard answered. Neither man spoke at first. Finally, Harold broke the silence. I heard you found something. Richard stared at the skyline. You're suspended. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then Harold laughed nervously. You can't be serious. I'm very serious. The laugh disappeared. Richard's voice hardened, effective immediately. He ended the call. No argument, no debate, no negotiation, just consequences. Back in the conference room, the Johnson family sat together quietly. No celebrations, no excitement, only exhaustion. Because justice didn't erase pain, it simply acknowledged it. Malik stared at the dark computer screen. His father's voice still echoed in his mind. Then he looked toward Richard. Everyone expected him to ask about compensation, about money, about lawsuits, about what came next. Instead, he asked something else, something that made every adult in the room stop breathing. Something so simple it shattered their hearts. Can my mom get better now? The room fell silent, and Richard Walker felt tears sting his eyes for the first time in years. Not because of the lawsuit, not because of the evidence, not because Harold Pierce had finally been exposed, but because after everything Malik had endured, after every hungry night, every humiliation, every sacrifice, the only thing the boy cared about was his mother. Not money, not revenge, not justice, his mother. Richard slowly sat down beside him. The city lights shimmered beyond the conference room windows. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Richard finally answered. We're going to do everything possible. Malik searched his face. Children had a way of recognizing dishonesty. Maybe because they hadn't learned to hide it themselves. After a few seconds, Malik nodded. He believed him. For the first time. Not completely, not blindly, but enough. Enough to let hope back into his heart. And that was a dangerous thing. Because hope could heal, but hope could also break people. Richard understood that, which was why he intended to be careful. Very careful. The following weeks changed everything. Grace was transferred to a specialized treatment program. Doctors who previously seemed out of reach now reviewed her case personally. Tests were repeated. New options were explored. Medications were adjusted. For the first time in years, her healthcare decisions were based on what she needed, not on what she could afford. The difference was remarkable. Slowly, she improved. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily. Every week brought small victories, more energy, less pain, more smiles. The Johnson family noticed. So did Ethan. One Saturday afternoon, he accompanied Richard to the hospital. When they entered Grace's room, they found Lily laughing. Actual laughter. The kind that filled a room. The kind that hadn't existed there before. Grace sat upright near the window. Sunlight touched her face. She looked stronger, healthier, alive. Look who's here, Lily announced. Ethan grinned. What are we celebrating? Grace smiled. The doctor said I'm responding well. The room brightened instantly. Malik lowered his head, trying unsuccessfully to hide his emotions. Ethan noticed. So did Richard. Nobody embarrassed him by mentioning it. Some feelings deserved privacy. That afternoon, as the children played cards near the window, Richard sat beside Grace. He handed her a folder. What is this? Something I've been working on. Grace opened it slowly. Her eyes widened, then widened again. By the third page, tears had appeared. "Richard," the billionaire smiled. "It's not charity." Grace looked up, confused. "It's recognition." Inside the folder sat documents restoring Marcus Johnson's name to the logistics platform he had designed. Years of false attribution were being corrected. Every internal record, every project history, every innovation archive. Marcus Johnson's contributions would finally be acknowledged. Publicly, officially, permanently. Grace pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. For years she had feared Marcus would be forgotten, that history would erase him, that the truth would disappear. Now the opposite was happening. The truth was finally returning. A few days later, another announcement followed. This one surprised even Richard's board of directors. The company launched a new initiative, the Marcus Johnson Foundation. Its mission was simple: provide meals, educational opportunities, and technology training for children facing economic hardship, especially children who, like Malik, had learned too early how heavy life could become. The media immediately took interest. News outlets requested interviews. Investors praised the decision. Community leaders offered support. But Richard wasn't thinking about public relations. He was thinking about a hungry boy at a bus stop. Everything had started there. One sandwich. One act of kindness. One child refusing to become selfish despite every reason to do so. A month later, the official launch event arrived. The ballroom overlooked downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Large screens displayed photographs of Marcus Johnson. Employees filled the room. Community leaders arrived. Journalists set up cameras. The atmosphere felt important, historic. Backstage, Malik adjusted the collar of his new suit. He hated suits. Lily loved hers. She had spent 20 minutes admiring herself in a mirror. Grace laughed every time she remembered it. "Relax," Ethan said. "I'm trying." "No, you're not." Malik rolled his eyes. Ethan laughed. The friendship between them had developed quietly, naturally, without effort. Neither boy fully understood it, but everyone else did. Trauma had introduced them. Kindness had connected them. Truth had bonded them. Eventually, someone knocked on the door. "They're ready." The ballroom lights dimmed. Richard Walker stepped onto the stage. Applause filled the room. He spoke briefly about integrity, about accountability, about recognizing overlooked contributions. Then he did something unexpected. He invited Malik onto the stage. The room applauded again. Malik froze. He hated attention. Ethan grinned. "You got this." Malik walked forward. Thousands of eyes followed him. Television cameras turned. Reporters raised notebooks. Yet somehow none of that frightened him as much as public speaking. When he reached the podium, silence settled across the ballroom. The prepared speech sat in his pocket. Richard had helped him write it. Several executives had reviewed it. Everyone expected him to read it. Instead, Malik looked out across the room, then folded the speech and put it away. The audience waited. "My dad used to tell me something." His voice trembled slightly, then steadied. He said people should be remembered for who they really are. Silence deepened. Malik continued. "A lot of people feel sorry for us." He glanced toward Grace, then Lily, then Richard. "We don't need pity." His words carried surprising confidence. We needed the truth. Several people wiped away tears, including some who barely knew the family. Malik swallowed. "My father wasn't perfect." A soft laugh moved through the audience. "He forgot birthdays." More laughter. "He sang terribly." Even Richard laughed. But he was honest. The room quieted again. And that's how I want people to remember him. Nothing dramatic, nothing rehearsed, nothing manipulative. Just truth. Simple truth. The audience rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Grace cried openly. Lily cried because Grace cried. Ethan felt something tighten in his throat. And Richard Walker experienced something rare. Pride. Not in his company, not in his success. In the boy standing on stage. The boy who had once searched dumpsters for food. The boy who had been judged, ignored, dismissed. The boy who had somehow remained kind anyway. Later that night, after the guests departed and the cameras disappeared, the Johnson family gathered outside the building. Chicago sparkled around them. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement. The city felt alive. Grace looked healthier than she had in years. Lily twirled in circles beneath the streetlights. Malik stood quietly beside Ethan. For a while, neither spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. You know what the weirdest part is? What? If you hadn't shared that sandwich. Malik laughed softly. You followed me because of a sandwich? Basically. The answer made them both laugh. Then Ethan became serious. That day changed my life. Malik looked at him. The honesty surprised him. Ethan rarely spoke about feelings. Neither boy did. But tonight felt different. It changed mine too, Malik admitted. Above them, the city lights glowed against the night sky. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, healed, almost complete. But the story wasn't over yet. Because exactly 1 year later, Ethan Walker would walk back into the same restaurant where he had once thrown away a perfectly good sandwich. And what happened there would reveal just how much he had truly changed. Chicago was bright that afternoon. Sunlight reflected from skyscraper windows. The city buzzed with the familiar rhythm of traffic, conversations, and distant train horns. A year had passed. A year since a hungry boy shared half a sandwich at a bus stop. A year since a billionaire's son followed him. A year since everything changed. The restaurant looked exactly the same. The polished floors, the tall windows, the leather booths, the soft music drifting through the dining room. Even the hostess stand stood in the same place. Yet to Ethan Walker, it felt like an entirely different world. Because he was no longer the same boy. At 13, he had grown taller. His voice had deepened slightly. But the biggest change wasn't visible. It lived inside him. Richard noticed it every day. So did Malik. So did everyone who truly knew him. The restaurant manager recognized the Walker family immediately. Mr. Walker. Richard smiled. It's been a while. The manager laughed. Far too long. As they were led toward their table, Ethan glanced across the dining room and stopped. Near the kitchen entrance stood Mrs. Carter, the elderly employee who had quietly cleaned up the sandwich he'd thrown on the floor a year earlier. Her silver hair was the same. Her warm smile was the same. Only now, Ethan noticed details he had ignored before. The slight stiffness in her knees, the tiredness in her hands, the kindness in her eyes. A year ago, he never would have noticed. Today, he did. Without thinking, he walked toward her. Mrs. Carter looked surprised. Can I help you, sweetheart? For a moment, Ethan simply stared. Then he smiled. I owe you an apology. The older woman blinked. What for? I threw food on the floor. Recognition slowly appeared. Then understanding. Then a smile. Oh! Ethan lowered his eyes. I was a jerk. Mrs. Carter laughed softly. The sound felt warm, genuine. You were a kid. I was still a jerk. That made her laugh even harder. Finally, she reached out and squeezed his shoulder. We all grow. The simple words hit harder than Ethan expected. We all grow. The statement carried a year's worth of meaning, a year's worth of mistakes, a year's worth of lessons. Before returning to work, Mrs. Carter smiled one last time. Your mother would be proud. Ethan looked confused. How do you know my mom? I don't. She pointed toward Richard. That's your father. Then toward Ethan's chest. And I can tell your mother raised you right. The compliment stayed with him long after she walked away. A few minutes later, another familiar face entered the restaurant. Malik Johnson. He wore a clean blue shirt and carried himself with quiet confidence. Not because he had become wealthy, because he no longer carried the weight of survival alone. Behind him came Grace and Lily. Grace looked remarkably different. Health had returned to her face. Energy had returned to her smile. Life had returned to her eyes. Richard stood immediately to greet them. The families embraced. The friendship between them had long since become something deeper. Not obligation, not charity. Family. Chosen family. The meal passed with laughter, stories, memories. At one point, Lily described the latest antics of the orange cat. Everyone laughed, even Richard. Especially Richard. For a few hours, life felt wonderfully normal. Then Ethan happened to glance out the window, and everything slowed. A boy sat alone on the sidewalk, maybe 10 years old. Thin jacket, worn sneakers, dark hair falling across his forehead. His eyes remained fixed on the restaurant window, not on the people, not on the decorations, on the food. The look was unmistakable. Hunger. Real hunger. Not boredom. Not preference. Need. Ethan stared. The noise of the restaurant faded. The conversations disappeared. The image pulled him backward through time, to the bus stop, to the sandwich, to Malik, to everything that followed. Across the table, Malik noticed. What is it? Ethan pointed quietly. Everyone turned. The boy remained outside, alone, watching. Grace saw him. So did Richard. And then Richard smiled, because he already knew what was coming, the same way he had known at the bus stop long ago. Ethan looked at his father. Dad? Richard leaned back. The smile widened. Yes? Ethan glanced outside again, then back at the table. Can we invite him to sit with us? Silence followed. Warm silence. The kind filled with understanding. Lily immediately grinned. Yes. Grace smiled. Malik smiled too. A very specific smile, because he understood something nobody else fully could. 1 year earlier, he had been that boy. Hungry, invisible, forgotten. Now Ethan saw him. Really saw him. The way Malik once saw a homeless man at a bus stop. Richard nodded. Go ahead. Ethan stood. He walked toward the door. Not quickly, not dramatically. Simply naturally. As if kindness had become part of him. Outside, the autumn air felt cool. Cars rolled past. Leaves drifted along the sidewalk. The boy looked nervous when Ethan approached. Ready to leave. Ready to disappear. The way people often do when they're used to rejection. Ethan sat beside him. Not above him. Beside him, hey. The boy looked up cautiously. Hi. Have you eaten today? The question sounded familiar. almost sacred. The boy hesitated, then shook his head. Ethan nodded. "Come eat with us." The boy blinked. "What?" "Come inside." The child looked toward the restaurant, then back at Ethan. Suspicion appeared. The same suspicion Malik once carried. "Why?" Ethan smiled. Because a year ago he wouldn't have known the answer. Today he did. Because someone did the same thing for me. The boy looked confused, but he followed. Inside, the staff prepared another chair, another plate, another meal. No speeches, no announcements, no applause, just kindness. Simple kindness, the most powerful kind. As everyone settled around the table, Ethan noticed Malik watching him. Their eyes met briefly. Neither needed words. Both remembered the bus stop, the sandwich, the beginning. Across the table, Richard sat quietly, observing, thinking. A year earlier, he believed success was measured by profits, growth, and achievements. Now he understood something larger. A company could change a city. Money could change circumstances. But kindness changed people, and changed them forever. The meal continued, the restaurant filled with warmth. Outside, Chicago continued moving. Inside, another small act of kindness quietly altered a life, just as one had altered Ethan's. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the skyline, the two families stepped onto the sidewalk together. Golden light reflected across the city. The moment felt peaceful, complete. Malik stood beside Ethan. "You know something?" "What?" Malik smiled. "You never got that drone." Ethan laughed. "I forgot about it." The answer surprised neither of them, because it was true. The drone, the sandwich, the selfishness, they belonged to another version of him, a version that no longer existed. Richard looked toward the setting sun, then toward the two boys, one born into wealth, one born into hardship. Yet somehow each had saved the other. People often believed this story was about a billionaire helping a struggling family, but that wasn't the whole truth. The deeper truth was much simpler. A hungry boy with a kind heart had changed the life of a billionaire's son. And because he chose kindness when life gave him every reason not to, an entire chain of hope began. One sandwich became a friendship. One friendship became justice. One act of kindness became a foundation helping thousands. And one boy who once threw away food learned to see the hunger hidden inside other people. The city lights slowly flickered on. The families walked away together. Not rich and poor, not different worlds. Just people. Connected by compassion. Connected by truth. Connected by a single choice. And somewhere in the distance, beneath the glow of Chicago's skyline, the memory of Marcus Johnson lived on exactly as he deserved. Not as a victim, not as a forgotten employee, but as a good man whose kindness survived through his son, and through everyone his son inspired. If this story touched your heart, remember one thing. You never know how far a small act of kindness can travel. Sometimes it changes a day, sometimes it changes a life, and sometimes it changes generations. When Ethan walked out of that restaurant and sat beside a hungry boy, then shared a meal just as Malik once shared half of his only sandwich, the story finally came full circle. What began at a lonely bus stop became something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. This story is a reminder that the people we overlook often carry more strength, dignity, and courage than we realize. The cost of judging someone too quickly is that we may miss the very person who could change our lives for the better. Today, Think about one person you've quietly made assumptions about without really knowing their story. The next time you see someone struggling, remember Malik and give yourself a chance to see the person before you see the circumstances. If this story touched your heart, comment one below. And tell me honestly, have you ever met someone who completely changed your view of the world after a single act of kindness? I'd love to read your story. And stay with us because the next story begins with one small decision that nobody thought mattered until it changed everything.